The fever had stolen Amelia Kane's hearing 3 days before the wagon train left her behind. And now she stood at the edge of Bentonville, Arkansas, with nothing but a worn carpet bag and the clothes on her back, watching the dust settle where her only connection to civilization had disappeared into the western horizon. It was the summer of 1867, and the war had ended just 2 years prior, leaving the frontier towns scattered across Arkansas filled with desperate souls seeking new beginnings. Amelia had been one of them, a 22-year-old woman from Philadelphia who had lost everything when her father's textile business collapsed after the Confederate surrender disrupted all the trade routes. The wagon master had promised safe passage to California, but when the fever took her hearing and left her weak for those crucial days, he had made it clear that the train could not wait. They had paid for her lodging at the small boarding house on the edge of town and left her with enough money for 2 weeks of meals, but after that, she would be on her own. The silence that surrounded her was not peaceful. It was thick and suffocating, like being trapped underwater while the world continued above the surface. She could see people's mouths moving as they passed her on the wooden sidewalk, could see the expressions of pity and discomfort cross their faces when they realized she could not hear them, but their voices were completely absent. The doctor in town, an elderly man with kind eyes and hands that shook with age, had examined her ears and shaken his head. The fever had damaged something inside, he explained through written notes, and there was no guarantee she would ever hear again. Amelia had cried that first night, pressing her face into the thin pillow in her rented room, feeling the sobs rack her body but hearing nothing, not even her own grief. But by the morning, she had dried her tears and made a decision. She would not give up. She would not return to Philadelphia in defeat. She would find a way to survive in this rough frontier town, even if she had to do it in complete silence. The boarding house proprietor, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Dalton, had been surprisingly kind. She spoke slowly so Amelia could read her lips, and she had helped Amelia find work washing dishes at the restaurant 2 buildings down. It was not glamorous work, but it paid enough to cover her room and meals, and the restaurant owner did not seem to mind that she could not hear. As long as the dishes were clean, he was satisfied. For 3 weeks, Amelia settled into a quiet routine. She woke before dawn, washed and dressed in her simple cotton dress, and walked to the restaurant where she spent hours up to her elbows in hot water and soap. The other workers left her alone, which suited her fine. She had learned quickly that most people did not have the patience to communicate with someone who could not hear, and she had grown tired of the frustration that crossed their faces when they tried. It was on a Wednesday morning in late July when everything changed. Amelia had finished her morning shift and was walking back toward the boarding house, her arms aching from the endless scrubbing, when she saw the crowd gathered outside the general store. She could see the agitation in their movements, the way they gestured wildly and pointed toward the mountains that rose in the misty distance beyond the town. An older man was shaking his head vehemently while a younger woman clutched her shawl and looked terrified. Amelia approached cautiously, trying to read lips, but too many people were talking at once. She caught fragments that made no sense. Something about the mountains, something about danger, someone named Marcus. A hand touched her shoulder and she jumped, spinning around to find Mrs. Dalton standing behind her. The older woman's face was grave as she pulled out a small notepad she had taken to carrying specifically for communicating with Amelia. "Mountain lions spotted near the logging camp," Mrs. Dalton wrote quickly. "3 men injured. They are bringing them down now." Amelia's eyes widened. The logging camp was about 5 miles up into the Ozark Mountains, where crews of men spent weeks at a time cutting timber to feed the growing demand for lumber throughout Arkansas and beyond. She had seen some of the loggers come into town occasionally, rough men with calloused hands and weathered faces, men who lived more comfortably in the wilderness than they ever would in civilization. Within the hour, a wagon rumbled into town, and Amelia joined the crowd that gathered to watch. 3 men lay in the back, their clothes torn and bloody. The doctor rushed forward with his bag, barking orders that Amelia could not hear, but could see in the urgency of his movements. The injured men were carried into the doctor's office, and the crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their daily routines with the resigned acceptance of people who had seen violence before. But Amelia noticed one man who had come down with the wagon, standing apart from everyone else. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that strained against his worn flannel shirt. His arms were thick with muscle, the kind that came from years of hard labor, and his hands looked strong enough to snap a tree branch with ease. Dark hair fell past his collar, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He stood with the stillness of someone completely comfortable in his own skin, watching the chaos with calm, intelligent eyes. Someone approached him, an older man in a suit who was probably some town official. Amelia watched their interaction, trying to read their lips, but the bearded man kept his responses brief. She caught only a few words. 3 more days. Need supplies. Going back up. The official seemed to be arguing, gesturing toward the doctor's office, clearly expressing concern about the danger. But the mountain man simply shook his head, his expression unchanging. When the official finally gave up and walked away, the tall man turned and his eyes met Amelia's across the street. She felt her breath catch. His eyes were a startling shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they held an intensity that made her want to look away and keep staring at the same time. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then he nodded once, a small acknowledgement of her presence, and turned to walk toward the general store. Amelia stood frozen for several heartbeats before she shook herself and hurried back toward the boarding house. She did not know why the stranger had affected her so strongly. She had seen plenty of men since arriving in Bentonville, and none of them had made her pulse race like that. That evening, Mrs. Dalton explained more about the situation over dinner. She wrote that the man Amelia had seen was Marcus Everett, a mountain man who had been working as a guide and hunter for the logging company. He lived up in the mountains most of the year, only coming to town a few times annually for supplies. The logging company had hired him because he knew the wilderness better than anyone, and he had a reputation for being able to track anything and survive in conditions that would kill most men. He is going back up tomorrow, Mrs. Dalton wrote, taking medical supplies and ammunition. The company wants to shut down the camp until the mountain lions move on, but Marcus says they can manage it if they are careful. Amelia read the note and felt an unexpected twist of concern. The man was going back up into danger, back to where 3 men had already been mauled. It seemed reckless, but from the brief glimpse she had gotten of Marcus Everett, reckless did not seem to be in his nature. He seemed calculated, controlled, like every action was carefully considered. She saw him again the next morning. She was walking to the restaurant before dawn when she spotted him loading supplies onto a sturdy mountain horse. He moved efficiently, checking every strap and knot with practiced ease. Amelia paused, watching him work in the dim pre-dawn light. He must have sensed her presence because he turned, his eyes finding her immediately. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Marcus raised his hand in a small wave. Amelia hesitantly waved back. He seemed to consider something, then walked toward her, his long strides covering the distance quickly. When he stopped in front of her, Amelia tilted her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, he was even more imposing, his sheer physical presence overwhelming. But there was nothing threatening in his expression, only curiosity. His lips moved and Amelia shook her head, pointing to her ears and then shaking her head again. The universal gesture for, "I cannot hear." Understanding crossed his face, followed by something that looked like sympathy but was not pitying. He glanced around, clearly looking for something to write with, but he had nothing. Instead, he did something unexpected. He raised his hands and began to gesture, pointing to himself and then toward the mountains, then making a gesture like he was returning, pointing back toward town. Amelia understood. He was telling her he would be back. Why he felt the need to communicate that to her, a complete stranger, she did not know. But she nodded to show she understood. Marcus smiled then, just a small curve of his lips beneath his beard, and the expression transformed his face. He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a small salute, then turned and swung up onto his horse with easy grace. Amelia watched him ride out of town, heading toward the mountains, and felt that strange twist in her chest again. The days that followed were difficult. Amelia heard through Mrs. Dalton's notes that there had been another attack at the logging camp, though this time no one was seriously injured. Marcus had tracked and killed one of the mountain lions, but there were at least 2 more in the area. The logging company had suspended operations until the threat was eliminated, but Marcus refused to leave. He was hunting the remaining cats, determined to make the area safe. Amelia found herself thinking about him more often than she wanted to admit. She did not know anything about him beyond his name and his reputation, but something about his quiet strength called to her. In a world that had suddenly become silent and isolating, his brief moment of making sure she understood him had meant more than he could possibly know. It was nearly 2 weeks before Marcus Everett returned to Bentonville. Amelia was finishing her evening shift at the restaurant, stepping out into the fading daylight when she saw him riding down the main street. He looked exhausted, his clothes dusty and worn, but he sat straight in the saddle. Behind him, tied to his horse, were the carcasses of 2 large mountain lions. The town came alive with excitement. People poured out of buildings to see the proof that the threat had been eliminated. The logging company foreman clapped Marcus on the back, clearly relieved. Money changed hands, payment for the dangerous work. Through it all, Marcus remained quiet and composed. He answered questions with brief nods or short responses, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. As soon as he could politely extract himself, he led his horse toward the stable, ignoring the people still trying to talk to him. Amelia watched from the shadows outside the restaurant. She should go back to the boarding house. She should not be standing here staring at a man she did not know. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Marcus emerged from the stable a few minutes later, walking toward the boarding house where apparently he kept a room when he was in town. His path would take him right past where Amelia stood. She should move, should step back into the restaurant, but before she could make up her mind, his eyes found hers. He changed direction immediately, walking straight toward her. Amelia's heart began to pound as he approached. When he stopped in front of her, she could smell the wilderness on him, pine and wood smoke and fresh air. He pointed toward the restaurant, then made an eating gesture, raising his eyebrows in question. Was he asking if she had eaten? Amelia nodded, pointing to herself and then gesturing to indicate she had just finished work. Marcus nodded in understanding. Then he pointed to himself, made the eating gesture and pointed to a spot beside him, raising his eyebrows again. Was he asking her to join him for a meal? Amelia's eyes widened in surprise. She should say no. It was not proper for an unmarried woman to dine alone with a man she barely knew, but propriety felt like a distant concern from her old life in Philadelphia. Here on the frontier, the rules were different. And more than that, she was desperately lonely. The silence had isolated her more than she had realized, and the thought of sitting across from someone, even if they could not truly converse, was too appealing to resist. She nodded, and Marcus's face lit up with that same small smile she had seen before. He gestured for her to wait, then disappeared into the restaurant. Amelia shifted nervously, wondering what she had just agreed to. Marcus emerged a few minutes later and gestured for her to follow him. Instead of going back into the restaurant, he led her around to the side where there were a few outdoor tables set up for warmer weather. He pulled out a chair for her at one of the tables, waiting until she sat before taking the seat across from her. Within minutes, the restaurant owner appeared with plates of food, beef stew with thick chunks of bread, and mugs of coffee. Marcus must have made arrangements inside. The owner set everything down with a knowing smile and left them alone. They ate in silence, but it was not awkward. Marcus ate with the efficiency of someone who viewed food as fuel, but he was not crude about it. Amelia found herself sneaking glances at him between bites, taking in the details she had not noticed before. The small scar above his left eyebrow. The way his large hands handled the spoon with surprising delicacy. The streaks of silver starting to thread through his dark hair, suggesting he was older than she had first thought, probably in his early 30s. When Marcus finished eating, he pushed his plate aside and pulled out a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. He wrote something and turned it so Amelia could read. "My name is Marcus Everett. I am 31 years old. I have lived in these mountains for 8 years." Amelia felt a flutter of warmth at his effort to communicate properly. She reached for the notebook and pencil, writing her own response. "My name is Amelia Kane. I am 22 years old. I came here from Philadelphia 3 months ago. I lost my hearing to a fever." Marcus read her words carefully, his expression thoughtful. He wrote again. "That must be difficult. How are you managing?" Amelia appreciated that he did not offer empty sympathy or false hope. She wrote back, "It is hard. People do not have patience for someone who cannot hear. But I am surviving." Marcus nodded, and something in his eyes suggested he understood more than most people would. He wrote once more, "I spend most of my time alone in the mountains. Silence does not bother me, but I imagine it is different when it is not your choice." Amelia felt tears prick her eyes at his understanding. She blinked them back quickly and wrote a simple response. "Yes." They continued their written conversation as the evening deepened around them. Marcus asked about her life in Philadelphia, what had brought her west, what her plans were. Amelia found herself opening up more than she had with anyone since losing her hearing. There was something about Marcus's steady presence that made her feel safe, like nothing could harm her while he was near. In turn, Marcus told her about his life in the mountains. He had come west after the war, unable to settle back into civilian life after 4 years of fighting. He had tried city living for a few months and had felt like he was suffocating. The mountains had called to him, and he had answered. He lived in a cabin he had built himself, about 10 miles up into the Ozarks, and he supported himself through hunting, trapping, and occasional work as a guide. "You get lonely," Amelia wrote. Marcus considered the question for a long time before responding. "Sometimes. But I prefer solitude to the wrong company. I have not met many people worth changing my life for." The way he looked at her when she read those words made Amelia's breath catch. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that suggested his feelings might be shifting, that perhaps he had just met someone worth considering. They talked until full darkness fell, and the restaurant owner came out to politely indicate he needed to close up. Marcus walked Amelia back to the boarding house, keeping a respectful distance but remaining alert to their surroundings. At the door, he wrote one more note. "May I see you again tomorrow?" Amelia nodded, perhaps too eagerly, and Marcus smiled. He touched his fingers to his forehead in that same small salute, then turned and walked away into the night. Amelia floated up to her room, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She had made a connection, found someone who did not seem bothered by her silence, who had taken the time to truly communicate with her. She lay in bed that night, replaying every moment of the evening, and admitted to herself that she was already developing feelings for the quiet mountain man. Over the next week, Marcus stayed in town, taking what he called a mandatory rest after the intense days of hunting the mountain lions. But Amelia suspected he had another reason for lingering. He met her every evening after her shift at the restaurant, and they would sit at that same outdoor table, passing the notebook back and forth, learning about each other. Marcus was remarkably patient with written communication. He never seemed frustrated by the slow pace, never acted like it was a burden. And as they talked, Amelia began to see beyond the intimidating exterior to the man underneath. Marcus was intelligent and well-read, despite his rough lifestyle. He had a dry sense of humor that translated well to the written word. He was kind to animals and respectful to everyone he encountered. And he looked at Amelia like she was the most fascinating person he had ever met. On the 5th evening, Marcus surprised her by not leading her to the restaurant. Instead, he took her hand, the first time he had touched her beyond helping her into or out of a chair, and led her toward the edge of town. Amelia went willingly, trusting him implicitly, though she could not have explained why. He brought her to a small hill overlooking Bentonville, where the view opened up to show the mountains rising in the distance, silhouetted against the sunset. They sat on the grass, and Marcus pulled out the notebook. "I wanted to show you this view, the mountains at sunset. It is my favorite sight in the world." Amelia looked at the vista, the way the dying light painted the peaks in shades of gold and purple, and she understood why he loved it. It was breathtaking. She wrote back, "It is beautiful. Thank you for sharing it with me." Marcus hesitated, then wrote again, his handwriting less steady than usual. "Amelia, I know we have only known each other a short time, but I feel something when I am with you that I have never felt before. You make me want to be around people again. You make me think about a different kind of life." Amelia's heart raced as she read his words. She looked up to find him watching her intently, vulnerability clear in his expression. This strong, capable man was opening his heart to her, and it was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. She took the pencil with a shaking hand and wrote, "I feel the same way. You are the first person since I lost my hearing who has made me feel like a whole person, not just someone to be pitied or avoided. When I am with you, the silence does not feel so heavy." Marcus read her words, and something fierce and tender crossed his face. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her cheek with his large, calloused hand. Amelia leaned into the touch, closing her eyes at the gentle contact. When she opened them, Marcus was closer, his face just inches from hers. He looked at her questioningly, asking permission. Amelia nodded, barely a movement, and Marcus closed the distance. His kiss was gentle, almost reverent, like he was afraid she might break. His beard was soft against her skin, and his lips were warm. Amelia's first kiss, and it was perfect, everything she had dreamed a kiss should be. When they pulled apart, both were breathing heavily, and Marcus rested his forehead against hers. They stayed like that as the sunset faded to twilight, sitting close together on the hill, not needing words or written notes to communicate what they were feeling. Amelia felt something settle in her chest, a rightness that she had not felt since before the fever took her hearing. Maybe this was why she had been left behind. Maybe fate had intervened because Marcus Everett was meant to be in her life. The next morning, reality intruded on their budding romance. Marcus met Amelia for breakfast, but his expression was troubled. He wrote quickly in the notebook, "The logging company wants me to guide a supply run up to the camp. They are reopening operations. I need to leave this afternoon and will be gone for at least a week, possibly 2." Amelia's stomach sank, but she forced herself to write a supportive response. "I understand. It is your work. I will be here when you return." Marcus shook his head and wrote more. "I do not want to leave you. These past days have been the happiest I can remember, but I need the money from this job. I am trying to save up to buy more land around my cabin, to expand and maybe start thinking about a different future." The implication in his words made Amelia's heart skip. A different future, one that might include her. She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. When he looked at her, she mouthed carefully, making sure he could read her lips even though she could not hear herself speak. "I will wait for you." Marcus's expression softened and he brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. They spent the rest of the morning together, Marcus delaying his departure as long as possible. Finally, when the sun was high overhead, he had to go. He held Amelia close, and she pressed her face against his broad chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. Even though she could not hear it, she could feel it, strong and sure, and it comforted her. Marcus tilted her face up and kissed her once more, deeper than before, pouring everything he could not say into the kiss. Then he was gone, riding up into the mountains, and Amelia was left watching the trail until he disappeared from sight. The days without Marcus crawled by. Amelia threw herself into her work, trying not to count the hours. Mrs. Dalton noticed her distraction and patted her hand sympathetically, writing notes of encouragement. The older woman clearly approved of Marcus, which made Amelia feel better about the speed with which her feelings had developed. It was on the 9th day that everything went wrong. Amelia was walking back from the restaurant in the early evening when she noticed people gathered in the street again, the same kind of agitated crowd she had seen before. Her stomach dropped as she hurried forward, trying to see what was happening. Mrs. Dalton found her in the crowd and thrust a note into her hands. "Accident at the logging camp. Tree fell wrong. Several men trapped. They are organizing a rescue party." Amelia's blood ran cold. Marcus was up there. He could be one of the trapped men. She grabbed Mrs. Dalton's arm and gestured frantically, trying to ask for more information. The older woman understood and wrote quickly, "I do not know if Marcus is injured. They sent one man down for help. He was badly shaken. The doctor and some others are preparing to go up." Amelia made a decision in that instant. She was going too. She did not care that it was dangerous or improper. Marcus might be hurt, and she needed to know he was all right. She needed to be there. She ran back to the boarding house and changed into her most practical clothes, a split skirt she had bought for riding and a sturdy blouse. She found Mrs. Dalton again and wrote quickly, "I am going with the rescue party. Do not try to stop me." Mrs. Dalton looked alarmed and wrote back, "Amelia, no, it is too dangerous. You cannot hear. You could get hurt." But Amelia shook her head firmly. She wrote one word, "Marcus." Mrs. Dalton read it and understanding crossed her face. She sighed and wrote, "You love him." Amelia nodded, not caring that it might be too soon or too fast. She did love him. She had fallen in love with the quiet mountain man who had seen past her disability to the person underneath, who had made her feel valued and cherished. and she was not going to sit safely in town while he might be injured or worse. Mrs. Dalton finally nodded and wrote, "I will help you get supplies, but please be careful." Within the hour, Amelia was mounted on a rented horse, her saddlebags filled with medical supplies and food. The rescue party consisted of the doctor, the logging company foreman, and 4 other men who knew the mountain trails. They looked skeptical when Amelia insisted on joining them, but she refused to back down. Finally, they agreed to let her come, though they made it clear she was to stay out of the way and follow instructions. The ride up into the mountains was harrowing. The trails were steep and narrow, winding through dense forest. Amelia's horse was sure-footed, but she gripped the reins tightly, very aware that one misstep could send them both tumbling down the mountainside. The men moved quickly, clearly anxious to reach the camp, and Amelia pushed her horse to keep pace. They reached the logging camp as darkness was falling. The scene was chaos. Men were shouting and pointing toward a massive fallen tree, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. Amelia could see that part of it had crashed into a rough shelter, the logs splintered and scattered. Several men were digging frantically at the debris, trying to reach whoever was trapped underneath. The doctor jumped from his horse and ran toward the wreckage, the foreman right behind him. Amelia dismounted more slowly, her eyes scanning the camp for any sign of Marcus. She could not see him anywhere, and fear clawed at her throat. A hand touched her arm, and she spun around to find one of the men from their party pointing toward the far side of the camp. Amelia looked and saw a group of men huddled around someone sitting on the ground. She ran toward them, pushing through the crowd. Marcus sat on a log, his shirt torn and blood staining his shoulder. The camp medic was trying to bandage the wound, but Marcus kept waving him away, trying to stand up. His face was pale and strained, but he was alive. He was alive. Amelia let out a sound she could not hear, something between a sob and a laugh, and Marcus's head snapped up. His eyes found hers across the space, and his whole expression changed. He stood abruptly, ignoring the medic's protests, and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Amelia crashed into him, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face against his chest. She could feel him flinch, his injured shoulder obviously painful, but he held her tightly with his good arm, his other hand coming up to cradle the back of her head. They stood like that for a long moment, Amelia shaking with relief and Marcus holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Finally, she pulled back just enough to look up at him. His face was dirty and exhausted, but his eyes were soft as he looked down at her. Marcus glanced around, clearly looking for something to write with, but there was nothing nearby. He was frustrated. Amelia could see it in his expression, wanting to communicate but unable to. She saw him struggling, saw him open his mouth to speak and then close it again, remembering she could not hear him. Then Amelia had an idea. She took his hand and placed it over her heart so he could feel it racing. Then she placed her hand over his heart, feeling the strong, rapid beat beneath her palm. She looked up at him, hoping he would understand what she was trying to say, that her heart spoke the same language as his. That words were not necessary to communicate what they felt. Marcus understood. She could see it in the way his expression cleared, in the way he pulled her close again. He bent his head, and Amelia rose on her toes to meet him. The kiss was different this time, urgent and desperate, both of them pouring their fear and relief and love into it. When they finally broke apart, the medic was standing nearby with arms crossed, looking impatient. Marcus sighed and let Amelia go reluctantly, allowing the medic to finish bandaging his shoulder. Amelia stayed close, her hand finding Marcus's and holding tight. Once the medic was done, Marcus led Amelia away from the chaos, toward a quieter part of the camp. He found his pack and pulled out his notebook and pencil, though writing with his injured shoulder clearly pained him. Amelia tried to take the notebook from him to spare him the effort, but he shook his head firmly and wrote, "When the tree fell, I was helping guide it down. Something shifted and it came down wrong. I pushed 2 men out of the way, but it caught my shoulder. They are still digging out 1 man who was in the shelter when it collapsed. I am fine, Amelia, but what are you doing here? It is dangerous." Amelia took the notebook and pencil from him gently and wrote her response. "I had to come. I had to know you were safe. I could not sit in town wondering if you were hurt or worse. Marcus, I know it has only been a short time, but I love you. I love you and I needed to be here." Marcus read her words and his hand started to shake. He set the notebook aside and pulled her close again, careful of his injured shoulder. Amelia felt him press his face into her hair, felt his chest rise and fall with deep breaths. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. He picked up the notebook again and wrote with his left hand, the letters shaky but legible. "I love you too. I have loved you since that first morning when you watched me load my horse. I have been trying to save money so I could offer you a real life, a cabin and land and security. But I cannot wait anymore. Amelia Kane, will you marry me? Will you come live with me in the mountains and build a life together?" Amelia felt tears stream down her face as she read his proposal. It was not traditional or fancy, written in a battered notebook at a logging camp while chaos reigned around them. But it was perfect because it was Marcus, honest and direct in offering her his heart. She took the pencil and wrote 1 word. "Yes." Marcus let out a breath that looked like relief and joy combined. He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise of all the kisses to come. Around them, the camp continued its frantic activity, but for that moment they existed in their own world. The rescue of the trapped man took most of the night. By some miracle, when they finally dug him out, he was alive, though badly injured. The doctor worked on him for hours while the rest of the camp waited anxiously. Marcus refused to rest despite his injured shoulder, helping where he could and keeping Amelia close to his side. By dawn, the crisis had passed. The injured man would survive, though he would need weeks of recovery. The logging company foreman made the decision to shut down operations for the rest of the season, deemed it too dangerous to continue after 2 serious accidents. The men would be paid for the remainder of their contracted time, and they would start packing up the camp immediately. Marcus was relieved by the decision. He wrote to Amelia that he had been uncomfortable with some of the safety practices at the camp, but his concerns had been dismissed. Now, at least, no one else would be hurt. The journey back down to Bentonville took most of the day. Amelia rode beside Marcus, watching him carefully for signs of pain or exhaustion. He was clearly hurting, but he kept a steady pace, anxious to get back to town so the doctor could properly examine his shoulder. Mrs. Dalton nearly fainted with relief when they rode into town that evening. She fussed over both of them, especially when Amelia showed her the written proposal in the notebook. The older woman's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Amelia into a tight hug, then did the same to Marcus, who looked startled but pleased by the affection. The doctor rebandaged Marcus's shoulder and declared that while it was a nasty wound, it would heal cleanly as long as he rested it properly. Marcus agreed, though Amelia suspected he would not be good at resting. Over the next few days, word spread through Bentonville about their engagement. Most people were surprised by the speed of the courtship, but frontier life did not allow for extended engagements. People got married quickly out here, both out of practicality and because life was uncertain. No one knew better than Amelia and Marcus how quickly things could change. They decided to marry as soon as Marcus's shoulder healed enough for him to travel comfortably. There was a preacher who came through Bentonville once a month, and they would time their wedding for his next visit. That gave them 3 weeks to prepare. Amelia spent those weeks in a blur of activity. Mrs. Dalton helped her sew a new dress, a simple but pretty design in pale blue cotton. They gathered supplies for the cabin, things Marcus had noted they would need. Amelia gave her notice at the restaurant, and the owner gave her a set of good cooking pots as a wedding gift, which touched her deeply. Marcus used the time to rest his shoulder and make trips up to his cabin to prepare it for Amelia's arrival. He had lived alone for so long that the space was purely functional, but he wanted to make it more comfortable for her. He brought down a list of improvements he planned to make, additions to the cabin, better furniture, a proper garden plot. Amelia read his plans and added her own ideas, and they spent hours designing their future home together. The night before the wedding, Mrs. Dalton threw a small party at the boarding house. A few of the women Amelia had befriended in town came, bringing small gifts and good wishes. They told stories about marriage and gave advice, some of it practical and some of it scandalous, making Amelia blush. Marcus had his own gathering at the saloon, though he left early, never having been comfortable in large social situations. Amelia lay in bed that night, too excited to sleep. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Marcus Everett. Tomorrow her new life would truly begin. She thought about everything that had happened, how the wagon train leaving her behind had seemed like the worst thing that could happen, but it had led her to Marcus. It had led her to love. The wedding took place in the small church at the edge of town. Amelia wore her new blue dress with her hair styled simply, loose curls pinned back from her face. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Mrs. Dalton had gathered that morning. Marcus stood at the front of the church wearing new clothes, a white shirt and dark vest, and pants that Mrs. Dalton had insisted he purchase for the occasion. He had trimmed his beard and tied his hair back, and Amelia thought he had never looked more handsome. His shoulder was still bandaged under his shirt, but he stood straight and strong, his eyes locked on her as she walked down the short aisle. The preacher performed the ceremony, and though Amelia could not hear the words, she could read them on his lips, the traditional vows that people had spoken for centuries. When it came time for their own vows, Marcus pulled out the notebook one last time. He had written his vows ahead of time, wanting them to be perfect. Amelia read them with tears streaming down her face. Amelia, you came into my life when I had given up on finding someone who understood me. You see past the rough exterior to the man underneath. You do not need words to know my heart, because you listen in ways that go deeper than hearing. I promise to protect you, to provide for you, to love you every day for the rest of my life. I promise to always make sure you feel heard, even in silence. I promise to build a home with you where you will always feel safe and cherished. I love you, and I will spend my life proving it. Amelia wiped her eyes and read her own prepared vows in response. Marcus, you gave me hope when I thought I had lost everything. You showed me that silence does not have to mean isolation, that love does not need sound to be real. You make me feel whole and valued, not despite my deafness but including all of who I am. I promise to stand beside you, to be your partner in all things, to love you through every challenge and celebrate every joy. I promise to learn the language of your heart, to listen with more than my ears. I love you, and I cannot wait to build our life together. The preacher pronounced them married, and Marcus kissed his bride in front of the small gathering of well-wishers. The kiss was tender and full of promise, and when they pulled apart, both were smiling. The reception was held at the restaurant, the owner having donated the space and food as his wedding gift. People danced and celebrated, and though Amelia could not hear the music, Marcus held her and moved with her, and she followed his lead, trusting him completely. They ate cake and accepted congratulations and gifts, and through it all, Marcus kept Amelia close, his hand always finding hers, his eyes always seeking her out. As the sun began to set, Marcus indicated it was time to leave. They said their goodbyes, hugging Mrs. Dalton tightly and promising to visit regularly. Then they mounted their horses, Amelia riding the same sturdy mare she had rented for the rescue trip, which Marcus had purchased for her as a wedding gift, and they rode toward the mountains. The cabin was about 2 hours' ride from Bentonville, up trails that wound through dense forest. Amelia followed Marcus's lead, trusting his knowledge of the terrain. As they climbed higher, the air grew cooler and fresher, scented with pine and wild honeysuckle. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, painting everything in golden light. They reached the cabin just as full darkness fell. Marcus dismounted and helped Amelia down, then lit a lantern so she could see. The cabin was larger than she had expected, a solid structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney. Marcus had clearly been working on it. She could see new shutters on the windows and a fresh coat of something that might have been protective oil on the wood. Marcus opened the door and gestured for Amelia to enter first. She stepped inside and looked around in wonder. The main room held a large fireplace, already laid with wood and ready to light. There was a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a comfortable-looking settee, and shelves lined with books. A doorway led to what appeared to be a small bedroom, and another door showed a pantry stocked with supplies. But what caught Amelia's attention most was the effort Marcus had clearly put into making the space welcoming. There were curtains on the windows, simple but cheerful. A colorful quilt was draped over the settee. Wildflowers stood in a jar on the table. He had done all this for her to make her feel at home. She turned to find Marcus watching her anxiously, clearly wanting to know what she thought. Amelia crossed the room and threw her arms around him, standing on her toes to kiss him thoroughly. When she pulled back, she mouthed clearly, "It is perfect." Marcus's face lit up with relief and joy. He held her close for a moment, then reluctantly pulled away to tend to the horses. Amelia used the time to explore more thoroughly, marveling at all the details Marcus had included. He had even set out some of her belongings that he had brought up earlier, making space for her things among his. When Marcus returned, he started a fire in the fireplace to ward off the evening chill. Then he came to Amelia and took both her hands, his expression turning serious. He led her to sit on the settee, then pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. He had written something earlier, and now he showed it to her. "Amelia, I want you to know that we do not have to do anything you are not ready for tonight or any night. This is your home, and you should feel safe and comfortable here. We have the rest of our lives together. There is no rush." Amelia read his words and felt her heart swell with love for this considerate man. She took the paper and pencil and wrote her response. "Marcus, I love you. I trust you completely. I am your wife, and I want to be your wife in every way. Do not hold back because you think you are protecting me. I am stronger than I look." Marcus read her words, and something heated flared in his eyes. He set the paper aside and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. He looked at her questioningly one more time, giving her a chance to change her mind. But Amelia leaned into his touch and nodded, permission and invitation combined. Marcus kissed her then, deeper than he ever had before, his gentleness giving way to passion. Amelia responded eagerly, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. He picked her up effortlessly, cradling her against his chest despite his still healing shoulder, and carried her to the bedroom. That night, in the quiet cabin with the fire crackling in the other room, Marcus and Amelia consummated their marriage. Marcus was gentle but thorough, taking his time to learn what made his wife gasp and sigh. Amelia could not hear the sounds she made, could not hear Marcus's words of love and praise, but she felt everything. She felt his hands on her skin, felt his weight and warmth, felt the connection between them that went deeper than physical. And when he pulled her close afterward, both of them sated and drowsy, she pressed her ear to his chest and felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the most beautiful sound in her silent world. The days that followed established a new rhythm to Amelia's life. She woke each morning to find Marcus already up, tending to the animals or working on some improvement to the cabin or property. She would make breakfast, and they would eat together, communicating through gestures and written notes, and increasingly, through an understanding that went beyond words. Marcus taught her about life in the mountains. He showed her which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to read the weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals, how to fish in the cold mountain streams. Amelia proved to be an eager student, and Marcus was a patient teacher. He never made her feel incapable because of her deafness. Instead, he showed her how her other senses could compensate, how she could feel vibrations in the ground to know when animals were approaching, how she could read the movement of leaves to gauge wind direction. In turn, Amelia brought softness to Marcus's rough life. She made the cabin into a true home, adding small touches of beauty and comfort. She cooked meals that went beyond simple sustenance, reminding Marcus that food could be enjoyable, not just necessary. She read books aloud in the evenings, not because Marcus could not read, but because he loved watching her face as she formed the words, even though she could not hear herself speak. And she showed him that physical affection and intimacy could be a regular part of life, not something rare or uncomfortable. They made trips to Bentonville every few weeks for supplies and to visit Mrs. Dalton. On one of these trips, about 3 months after their wedding, Amelia sought out the doctor privately. She had noticed changes in her body, signs that she recognized from the medical books she had read. The doctor confirmed what she suspected. She was pregnant. Amelia debated how to tell Marcus. She wanted it to be special, memorable. That evening, back at the cabin, she made his favorite meal and waited until they had finished eating. Then she took out the notebook and wrote carefully, "Marcus, I have something important to tell you. In about 6 months, our family is going to grow. We are going to have a baby." Marcus read the words once, then again, as if he could not quite believe them. Then he looked up at Amelia with an expression of such pure joy and wonder that it took her breath away. He stood so quickly his chair fell over backward, and he pulled Amelia into his arms, holding her carefully but firmly. She felt him shaking and realized he was crying, tears of happiness soaking into her hair. When he finally pulled back, his face was wet but smiling. He cupped her face and kissed her gently, reverently, like she was the most precious thing in the world. Then he dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his face to her still flat stomach, his hands spanning her waist. Amelia ran her fingers through his hair, her own eyes filling with tears at his tender reaction. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Marcus was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly asking if Amelia was feeling well, if she needed anything, if she was doing too much. Amelia found it endearing even when it was slightly annoying. She wrote him notes reminding him that pregnant women had been working and living normal lives for all of human history, but Marcus could not seem to help himself. He loved her and the child she carried, and he wanted them both safe. As winter approached, Marcus made sure the cabin was thoroughly prepared. He stocked the pantry with enough supplies to last for months, in case they got snowed in. He chopped enough firewood to keep them warm until spring. He made improvements to the cabin's insulation, and added a small room that would serve as a nursery. The first snow fell in late November, transforming the mountains into a winter wonderland. Amelia stood at the window, watching the fat flakes drift down, and felt Marcus's arms come around her from behind. He rested his chin on top of her head and held her gently, his hands settling protectively over her rounded stomach. They stood like that for a long time, watching the snow and feeling the baby move between them, a perfect moment of peace and contentment. Christmas was quiet but joyful. They exchanged simple gifts. Marcus had carved a beautiful cradle for the baby, the wood polished smooth and decorated with simple designs. Amelia had knitted him a thick sweater and socks, her stitches even and precise. They ate a feast that Amelia had prepared, roasted venison and vegetables, and a pie made from preserved berries. And they spent the evening by the fire, Amelia leaning against Marcus's chest, his arms wrapped around her, both of them dreaming about the future and the child who would join them in the spring. In February, when Amelia was heavily pregnant and moving slowly, they had a scare. A winter storm hit hard, and Marcus went out to secure the animals and make sure everything was battened down. He was gone longer than expected, and Amelia began to worry. She could not call out to him, could not hear if he responded. She waited by the window, anxiety mounting with each passing minute. When Marcus finally appeared through the blowing snow, Amelia nearly collapsed with relief. He stumbled into the cabin, his face raw from the wind, ice crusting his beard. He was clearly exhausted and cold, but his first action was to check on Amelia, making sure she was all right. Amelia helped him out of his frozen clothes and wrapped him in blankets by the fire. She made hot coffee and held the mug to his lips until he could hold it himself. Once he was warming up, he pulled out the notebook with stiff fingers and wrote. One of the horses broke loose. Had to track her down and bring her back. I am sorry I worried you. Amelia shook her head and wrote back. You are safe. That is all that matters. But Marcus, this made me realize something. I need a way to know you are all right when you are out of my sight. I cannot hear you call for help. I cannot hear warnings. It terrifies me. Marcus read her words and understanding crossed his face. He thought for a moment, then wrote. What if we establish signals? I could hang a flag or cloth outside when I go out, take it down when I come back. You would know I am working nearby. And we could have an emergency signal, something visual I could use if I needed help. They worked out a system over the next few days. Marcus rigged up a pulley system with colored flags. A white flag meant he was working nearby. A red flag meant there was danger or he needed help. He made sure Amelia understood the system thoroughly and practiced using it until she felt comfortable. The system gave Amelia peace of mind. She could glance out the window and see the flag, know that Marcus was safe and working. And Marcus was careful to always update the flag, knowing his wife was watching for it. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought an explosion of new life. The forest turned green, flowers bloomed, animals emerged from winter dens. And on a warm April afternoon, Amelia went into labor. Marcus had been preparing for this for months. He had Mrs. Dalton come up to the cabin 2 weeks before the baby was due, and the older woman had stayed in the small guest room Marcus had added, ready to help with the birth. When Amelia's pain started, Mrs. Dalton took charge with calm efficiency, and Marcus tried very hard not to panic. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Marcus stayed by Amelia's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, offering what comfort he could. He hated seeing her in pain and felt helpless to ease it. But Amelia drew strength from his presence, squeezing his hand during contractions and reading his lips as he encouraged her. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their daughter was born. Mrs. Dalton placed the tiny, wailing infant on Amelia's chest, and both parents stared in wonder at the miracle they had created. The baby had dark hair like her father and was already showing signs of having his strong build. But when she opened her eyes, they were the same warm brown as Amelia's. Marcus cut the cord with shaking hands, then sat on the bed beside his wife and daughter, his arm around Amelia's shoulders. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at them, his whole world contained in that bed. Mrs. Dalton discreetly left them alone, giving the new family privacy for their first moments together. Amelia looked up at Marcus and mouthed. "What should we name her?" Marcus thought for a moment, then carefully touched Amelia's cheek and pointed to her, then to the baby. He wanted to name their daughter after Amelia, but Amelia shook her head and pointed to the window where they could see the mountains in the fading light. She mouthed, "Hope. We should name her Hope because she is our hope and our future." Marcus nodded, more tears spilling down his cheeks. He leaned in and kissed Amelia's forehead, then gently stroked one finger down their daughter's tiny cheek. Hope. It was perfect. The weeks that followed were exhausting and wonderful. Hope was a healthy baby with good lungs, and while Amelia could not hear her cries, she could feel the vibrations when the baby wailed. Marcus took to fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Hope when she was fussy, and stared at his daughter with such obvious adoration that Amelia fell in love with him all over again. One evening, when Hope was about a month old, Amelia was nursing the baby by the fire while Marcus did some leatherwork nearby. Hope finished eating and fell asleep in Amelia's arms, her tiny face peaceful. Marcus looked up and smiled at the sight, then set aside his work and came to sit beside them. He wrote in the notebook, "I never imagined I could be this happy. Before I met you, I thought I would spend my life alone in these mountains, and I was content with that. But now, with you and Hope, I realize I was not truly living before. You both are my whole world." Amelia read his words through a blur of tears. She shifted Hope to one arm and used her free hand to write. "You saved me, Marcus. When I lost my hearing, I lost hope. I thought I would spend my life isolated and alone, a burden to everyone around me. But you showed me that I am not broken, just different. You taught me that love does not need words, and you gave me a family and a home. I love you more than I can ever express." Marcus read her response and pulled both his wife and daughter into a careful embrace. They sat like that for a long time, a family bound by love that transcended words. As Hope grew, Amelia and Marcus were delighted to discover that she was meeting all her developmental milestones perfectly. But more importantly, they noticed that she responded to sounds. She would turn her head when Marcus spoke, would startle at loud noises. She could hear. The realization filled Amelia with complex emotions. She was grateful that her daughter would not face the challenges of deafness, but she also worried. Would Hope grow frustrated with a mother who could not hear her? Would the lack of shared experience create a barrier between them? Marcus, perceptive as always, noticed her worry. He wrote in the notebook, "Hope will love you because you are her mother, because you are kind and strong and wonderful. Your deafness is just one part of who you are. We will teach her to communicate in all the ways we have learned. She will grow up knowing that love is expressed through actions and presence, not just words, and that will make her a better, more compassionate person." His words eased Amelia's fears, and as Hope grew, Marcus proved right. The little girl learned early to face her mother when speaking, to use gestures and expressions. She learned to read and write young, using the same notebooks her parents used, and she grew up watching her father treat her mother with respect and tenderness, learning what real love looked like. The years passed in a blur of happiness. They added to their cabin, building more rooms as their family grew. 2 years after Hope, they had a son they named Matthew, who had his mother's coloring and his father's temperament. 3 years after that came another daughter, Emma, who was the perfect blend of both parents. Marcus expanded his land holdings, purchasing adjacent property when it became available. He built a larger barn and acquired more livestock. The family was comfortable, not wealthy but secure, and they wanted for nothing important. Amelia continued to amaze Marcus with her strength and adaptability. She managed the household efficiently, taught the children to read and write and do mathematics, tended a large garden, and still found time to pursue her own interests. She had started making beautiful quilts, which she occasionally sold in Bentonville, and she had begun writing down stories for the children, her own tales of adventure and love. On their 10th anniversary, Marcus surprised Amelia with a special gift. He had been working on it for months, and he led her outside with the children trailing curiously behind. There, in the clearing in front of the cabin, stood a small structure with a sign above the door. Amelia walked closer, trying to read the sign in the late afternoon light. When she made out the words, she gasped. It read, "Amelia's Library." She turned to Marcus with wide eyes, and he smiled, pulling out the ever-present notebook. "You have filled our home with books, but we are running out of space, so I built you a library. A place that is just yours, where you can read and write and think. I know how much you love stories, and I wanted you to have a special place for them." Amelia walked into the small building, the children and Marcus following. Inside, Marcus had built floor-to-ceiling shelves, already filled with every book Amelia owned and many new ones he had purchased. There was a comfortable chair by the window with good light for reading and a desk where she could write. It was perfect. Amelia turned to her husband, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around him. The children, understanding that something important was happening even if they did not fully grasp what, joined the hug, wrapping their small arms around their parents' legs. That evening, after the children were in bed, Marcus and Amelia sat on the porch watching the stars. The night was warm, the air filled with the sound of crickets that Amelia could not hear but Marcus could. He had described the sound to her once in writing, and now she imagined she could hear it, a gentle symphony of summer. Marcus pulled her close, and Amelia rested her head on his shoulder. They did not need words or notebooks in that moment. They had built a language all their own over the years, one of touches and looks and shared understanding. Amelia thought back to that frightened young woman who had been left behind in Bentonville, who had thought her life was over. She thought about all the twists and turns that had led her to this moment. Sitting on a porch in the mountains with a husband she adored and 3 healthy children sleeping inside their home, she could not hear the crickets or the wind in the trees. She could not hear Marcus's breathing or her children's soft snores. But she could feel Marcus's arm around her shoulders, feel the steady rise and fall of his chest. She pressed her ear against his heart, that place she had learned to listen years ago, and felt the rhythm that was as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. Marcus looked down at her, and even in the darkness, Amelia could see the love in his eyes. He raised his hand and signed one of the few signs they had learned from a traveling family a few years back. "I love you," his fingers said clearly. Amelia smiled and signed back, "I love you too." They sat like that until the stars wheeled overhead and the moon rose high. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a love that needed no sound to be real. and in the quiet cabin behind them, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and safe. The mountain man and the woman who could not hear his voice had let their hearts speak instead, and they had created something beautiful, something lasting. They had created a home filled with love, and that was worth more than any words ever spoken. Years continued to pass in the mountains, each season bringing its own rhythm to the Everett family. Hope grew into a young woman with her father's quiet strength and her mother's determination. She learned to hunt and track from Marcus, and she developed a love for healing, often accompanying Mrs. Dalton when the older woman made her rounds treating sick neighbors. Matthew proved to be a natural with animals, spending hours working with the horses and developing a reputation, even as a young teenager, for being able to calm the most skittish creatures. Emma, the youngest, inherited her mother's love of stories and her father's practical nature, always asking questions about how things worked and why. Marcus aged gracefully, his dark hair now thoroughly streaked with silver, his beard more white than black. But he remained strong, his muscular frame still capable of the hard physical labor that mountain life required. He moved a bit slower now, favoring his right shoulder on cold days when the old injury ached, but he remained vital and engaged with life. Amelia, now in her late 30s, had grown into herself completely. The uncertainty and fear that had marked her younger years had been replaced with quiet confidence. She knew who she was and what she was capable of. Her deafness was simply a fact of her existence, neither a tragedy nor something to be overcome. It just was, and she had built a full, rich life around it. They still made regular trips to Bentonville, though the town had grown considerably over the years. The railroad had finally reached Arkansas, bringing an influx of new settlers and businesses. Mrs. Dalton had passed away 5 years prior, leaving her boarding house to Amelia in her will, recognizing the special bond they had formed. Amelia had sold the property, using the money to establish a small school for deaf children in Bentonville, the first of its kind in that part of Arkansas. The school operated on donations and the funds from Amelia's inheritance, and Amelia made the trip to town twice a month to work with the students and their families. She taught them the signs she had learned, helped them develop communication strategies, and most importantly, she showed them that deafness did not mean a life of limitation. Marcus always accompanied her on these trips, proud of the difference his wife was making. On a crisp October afternoon, Marcus and Amelia sat on their porch, watching the fall colors paint the mountains in shades of red and gold. The children were off doing their various chores and activities, and the couple enjoyed a rare moment of quiet together. Marcus pulled out the notebook, which after all these years was worn and well used, the pages filled with years of conversations. He wrote, "You ever regret it? The way our life turned out, you could have had a different life in a city with more opportunities and conveniences." Amelia read his words and shook her head firmly. She took the pencil and wrote, "Never. Not once. Marcus, you gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. You gave me love, family, purpose. What more could anyone want? The silence that I feared would isolate me forever has instead become a kind of peace. I see the world differently than others, and that is a gift in its own way. No, I regret nothing." Marcus read her response and felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even after all these years, she could still move him to tears with her words. He reached out and took her hand, bringing it to his lips and kissing her knuckles gently. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. After a while, Marcus wrote again, "The children are growing up. Hope will likely marry soon. That young man from the logging camp has been coming around quite regularly." Amelia smiled and nodded. She had noticed the courtship developing and approved. The young man, Thomas, was respectful and hardworking, and most importantly, he treated Hope like she was precious. He had also taken the time to learn to communicate with Amelia, never making her feel like an outsider in conversations. "And Matthew has been talking about expanding the livestock operation," Marcus continued writing. "He wants to try breeding horses specifically for mountain work. I think he has a good head for it." "What about Emma?" Amelia wrote. "She has been very quiet lately." Marcus nodded thoughtfully before responding. "I think she is trying to decide what she wants. She loves the mountains, but she also dreams of traveling, of seeing more of the world. She reminds me of you when you first arrived in Bentonville, full of questions and curiosity." Amelia considered this. Emma was only 14, still young, but old enough to start thinking about her future. Amelia wrote, "We should encourage her to pursue whatever calls to her heart. We have built a good life here, but it may not be the right life for all our children. They should find their own paths." Marcus agreed, though Amelia could see the hint of sadness in his eyes at the thought of any of their children leaving the mountains. But that was parenthood, she supposed. You raised your children to be independent and strong, and then you had to let them go find their own way. That winter brought changes to the Everett household. Hope announced her engagement to Thomas, and preparations began for a spring wedding. The family threw themselves into planning, with Amelia sewing Hope's wedding dress and Emma decorating the cabin for the ceremony. Marcus took Thomas aside one evening, and while Amelia could not hear their conversation, she saw the serious expression on her husband's face as he spoke to his future son-in-law. Later, Thomas sought out Amelia and wrote in the notebook, "Mrs. Everett, your husband just gave me the most serious talking to I have ever received. He made it very clear that Hope is precious to your family and that I am expected to treat her with respect and love for the rest of my life. I want you to know that I understand and I agree completely. I love Hope, and I will spend my life making her happy." Amelia felt tears prick her eyes as she read his earnest words. She reached out and patted his cheek affectionately, then wrote, "Welcome to our family, Thomas. We are glad Hope found you." The wedding took place on a beautiful May morning. The ceremony was held outside, in the clearing in front of the cabin, with mountains rising majestically in the background. A preacher came up from Bentonville to perform the ceremony, and neighbors from miles around gathered to celebrate. Amelia watched her daughter marry the man she loved and felt her heart might burst with happiness. Hope looked beautiful in her simple white dress, her face glowing with joy. Thomas stood tall and proud beside her, his love for Hope clear in every glance and gesture. During the ceremony, as vows were exchanged, Marcus reached over and took Amelia's hand. She looked at him and saw tears on his weathered cheeks. He was remembering their own wedding, she knew, thinking about how far they had come since that day. Amelia squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, a private moment of connection in the midst of the celebration. After the ceremony, there was food and dancing and laughter. Amelia could not hear the music, but Marcus danced with her anyway, holding her close and moving to a rhythm only he could hear. Their children and neighbors smiled at the sight, all of them familiar with the deep love between Marcus and Amelia Everett. As the sun set on the wedding day, Hope and Thomas prepared to leave for their own cabin, which Thomas had been building for months. Hope hugged her parents tightly, tears streaming down her face. Amelia held her daughter close, committing the moment to memory, knowing that while Hope would still be nearby, this marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Marcus shook Thomas's hand firmly, then pulled the younger man into a brief, hard hug. When they separated, Marcus wrote quickly in the notebook, "Take care of her. And remember, we are just over the ridge if you need anything." Thomas nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the trust being placed in him. As the newlyweds rode away toward their new home, Marcus wrapped his arm around Amelia's waist. Matthew stood on his mother's other side, and Emma pressed close to her father. They stood together, the four of them, watching until Hope and Thomas disappeared into the trees. Life continued in its new rhythm. Hope and Thomas proved to be a strong partnership, building a life much like Marcus and Amelia had built. Within a year, Hope announced she was pregnant, and Amelia prepared to become a grandmother. Matthew expanded the livestock operation as he had planned, and he proved to have inherited his father's business sense. He traveled occasionally to other ranches and farms, learning new breeding techniques and bringing back ideas for improvements. He was courting a young woman from Bentonville, a practical girl named Sarah who loved the mountains as much as he did. Emma, as predicted, grew restless as she moved through her teenage years. She loved her family and her home, but she dreamed of seeing more of the world. When she was 16, an opportunity presented itself. A family friend who ran a bookstore in Little Rock offered Emma a position as an assistant, with room and board included. It would give her a chance to live in a city, to see something beyond the mountains. The decision was not easy. Emma was the baby of the family, and Marcus struggled with the idea of her leaving. But Amelia reminded him of what they had agreed, that their children should pursue their own paths. After much discussion and many tears, they agreed to let Emma go, at least for a trial period. The day Emma left for Little Rock, the whole family gathered to see her off. She would travel with a group heading east, which would keep her safe on the journey. Emma hugged each family member tightly, promising to write regularly. When she came to Amelia, Emma held her mother for a long time. Then she pulled back and signed, using the language they had all learned over the years. "Thank you for teaching me that women can be strong and independent. I will make you proud." Amelia signed back, "You already have. Now go have your adventure." After Emma left, the cabin felt empty in a way it never had before. Marcus and Amelia wandered the rooms, adjusting to having only Matthew still at home, and even he was frequently gone, working with the livestock or courting Sarah. One evening, Marcus and Amelia sat by the fire, the silence between them heavier than usual. Marcus pulled out the notebook and wrote, "Is this what it feels like when children grow up? This strange mix of pride and sadness." Amelia read his words and nodded. She wrote back, "Yes. We raised them to fly, and now we must watch them go. But they are not really gone. They carry us with them in the values we taught them and the love we showed them, and they will come back. This is still their home." Marcus read her response and felt some of the weight lift from his chest. She was right, as she so often was. Their children were growing up and moving into their own lives, but the bonds they had forged as a family would not break just because of distance. A few months later, Hope gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Marcus, after her father, and when the elder Marcus held his grandson for the first time, he wept openly, overcome with emotion. Amelia watched her husband with their grandchild and felt her heart fill near to bursting. They had created not just a family but a legacy, a line of love that would continue long after they were gone. Letters from Emma arrived regularly, full of descriptions of city life and the bookstore. She was thriving, learning about literature and publishing, meeting people from all over the country. But her letters always ended the same way. "I miss you all. The city is exciting, but the mountains are home." Matthew married Sarah in a quiet ceremony the following spring, and they moved into a cabin Matthew had built on the far side of the family property. Sarah fit into the family seamlessly, and she and Amelia became close, with Sarah often seeking out her mother-in-law's advice and company. As Marcus and Amelia entered their 50s, they began to slow down, not dramatically but noticeably. Marcus no longer took the most dangerous hunting trips, content to let Matthew handle those. His shoulder bothered him more frequently, especially in cold weather, and Amelia noticed he moved more stiffly in the mornings. Amelia's hair had gone silver, and her hands sometimes ached from arthritis, making writing more difficult. But her mind remained sharp, and she continued her work with the school for deaf children, now training younger teachers to take over the daily operations. One autumn evening, 23 years after they had first met, Marcus and Amelia took a walk to the hill where Marcus had proposed. They did not walk as quickly as they once had, and they had to stop to rest more frequently, but they made it to their special spot. They sat on the grass, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of purple and gold. Marcus had brought the notebook, now one of several dozen that documented their years together. He wrote, "Do you remember the first time I brought you here? I was so nervous. I thought you might say no." Amelia smiled and wrote back, "How could I say no? You had already stolen my heart. I think I fell in love with you that very first morning when you took the time to make sure I understood you were coming back from the mountains. No one else had bothered to really communicate with me, but you did. You saw me as a person, not just a deaf woman. That meant everything." Marcus read her words, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He wrote, "I saw a beautiful, brave woman who refused to give up despite losing something precious. I saw someone strong enough to build a new life in a rough place. I saw my future, though I did not fully realize it then. Marrying you was the best decision I ever made." They continued writing, reminiscing about their years together, the challenges they had faced and the joys they had shared. As the sun sank below the horizon and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus set the notebook aside and pulled Amelia close. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he rested his cheek against her hair. They sat like that, watching the stars emerge one by one, comfortable in the silence that had once frightened Amelia but had become a companion over the years. Marcus felt Amelia shift, and then she did something she had not done in a while. She pressed her ear to his chest, right over his heart, the way she had that first time when words had failed them and his heart had to speak for him. Marcus wrapped both arms around her, holding her close as she listened to his heartbeat. The steady rhythm that had comforted her through illness and injury, through childbirth and child-rearing, through every challenge they had faced together. The heartbeat that spoke of love and commitment and a life well lived. As they sat there under the stars, Marcus thought about everything they had built together. A home, a family, a legacy of love that would outlast them both. He thought about the frightened young woman who had been left behind in Bentonville and the lonely mountain man who had given up on finding connection. He thought about how those two broken pieces had come together to create something whole and beautiful. Amelia felt Marcus's heart beating strong and steady beneath her ear, and she thought about how this moment was perfect. She could not hear the wind in the trees or the distant call of an owl. She could not hear the creek bubbling in the valley below or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, but she could feel Marcus's heart, and in that rhythm she heard everything that mattered. Love, home, forever. They stayed on the hill until the moon rose high, bathing the mountains in silver light. When they finally stood to make their way back to the cabin, they walked hand in hand, moving slowly but steadily, two people who had found their place in the world and each other. The lights from their cabin glowed warm in the distance, and smoke rose from the chimney where Matthew had undoubtedly started a fire for them. Their family waited in that light, grown and changed but still bound together by the love Marcus and Amelia had modeled for them. As they approached their home, Marcus stopped and turned to face Amelia. In the moonlight, he looked both younger and older than his years, his face showing the marks of a life lived outdoors but his eyes holding the same gentle strength they had always had. He raised his hands and signed, clear and deliberate in the moonlight, "I love you, always have, always will." Amelia signed back, tears streaming down her face, "I love you too. Thank you for hearing my heart when I could not hear anything else." They stood there for a moment longer, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life of love in the silence and the mountains. Then Marcus took Amelia's hand once more, and together they walked into the warm glow of their home, ready to face whatever years remained to them with the same courage and love that had carried them through everything else. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warm and bright. Matthew and Sarah had indeed prepared everything for the evening, and they greeted Marcus and Amelia with smiles and warm embraces. Later that night, as Marcus and Amelia prepared for bed, they moved through their long-established routine with the comfort of decades of practice. As they lay in bed, Amelia curled into Marcus's side, her head once again finding that perfect spot on his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. Marcus's arm came around her automatically, holding her close. This was how they had ended nearly every day for 23 years, and Marcus hoped they would end many more this way, in the darkness, with no need for notebooks or signs. They communicated in the oldest language of all, the language of touch and presence, of breath and heartbeat, of two people who had chosen each other and continued choosing each other every day. The mountain man and the woman who could not hear had let their hearts speak, and those hearts had spoken of a love that transcended words, a love that built families and legacies, a love that would echo through generations in the mountains of Arkansas. And as they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, both knew with absolute certainty that they had lived a life worth living together.